Welcome back, everyone. I am Cas Piancey. I'm joined, as usual, by my partner in crime, Mr. Bennett Tomlin, and the world is crumbling around us, so let's just stop there. We're joined by a special guest today, Mr. Rohan Grey, who is a law professor at Willamette University. And he's joining us now. I think this is the third time we've had him on, so this is one of our favorite guests. He did a particularly poignant paper.
It's actually the fourth
time that we've had him on. But he did a particularly poignant paper, digitizing the fisc, and we wanted to have him on to talk about it as everything goes to hell. Rohan, thank you for joining us on that depressing note. Bennett, where do you want to start this? This is a dense paper.
Rohan, could you tell us what the Treasury Bureau of Fiscal Services is and why it is important?
Yeah, it's the most boring bureaucrat you've never heard of with the most important job in the whole of government, right? There's a couple of people in the office, of course, but it's essentially the people in Treasury that move the money around. Now, the best way to think about it is there's three levels, but the Bureau of the Fiscal Service is in the middle and it's the most politically sensitive. But the three levels from the bottom are the Fed. The Fed's like the bare metal rails, right? This is like the zeros and ones. It moves the accounting around. The Treasury's in the middle, the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. Their job is to send the instructions to the Fed. So the Fed pretends that it's dumb. It's just sitting there. If somebody sends the right payments instruction, it moves the money around. If not, it doesn't. Very convenient place to be in the middle of a war, to stay out of it all, right? Central banks are very good at this. They're moving around money in World War I on both sides. They're moving around Nazi money in World War II, pretty much until you get to the late 1970s and then brown people in the Middle East start, doing politics. Up until then, the central banks usually don't politicize their own layer. Right. So you've got the accounting layer at the Fed, then the Treasury is doing the payments instructions to the Fed. And then above that, you've got this other agency called the Office of Management and Budget, which is basically the president's lapdog, and that one is really the legal authority. So you need the official signature, then you need the instruction, and then you need it to be processed. Bureau of Fiscal Service is the one that does the instructions on behalf of the whole government. And part of the idea is it's easier than the Fed getting 1 million people. The Fed doesn't even like, any human beings. It would rather only deal with financial institutions if it could. Its perfect school has no children, like the Trunchbull in Matilda. So even dealing with other human beings in the government is annoying. They would rather just deal with one and have that person deal with everybody else. So you go to the Bureau of Fiscal Service, you've got your legal authority from the Office of Management and Budget, and then you get the payment instruction. The Fed goes, I'll listen to the Treasury. So that's what the office is. It's the office that processes about 88% of all federal payments through the Treasury's bank account at the Fed.
And so can you talk about kind of the risks if a bad faith actor were to insert themselves into that bureau and the broader process it is a part of?
Sure. Hypothetically, right? Completely hypothetically, imagine you are, say the president, and you, gave up on the idea that there's a separation of powers such that not only do you get to control the entire executive branch, right? There's no such thing as independent agencies. There's no such thing as, commissions and heads of agencies. Everyone is just your loyal subject. You're in a gold-plated castle, and you decide that that's not enough for you. You also want the power of the purse. So you're not only relitigating the New Deal with the administrative agencies, you're not only really even litigating Lincoln, you're actually going all the way back and litigating like the 1600s glorious revolution in Parliament. Like, actually, the king doesn't have to listen to Parliament. I get to run the money, taxation without representation. Like, I'm representative. You're welcome, right? It's a democratic king, so now I can tax from the king's seat. So the risk with the Bureau of Fiscal Service is that it's the last chokehold for 88% of the government before you go and actually get the money. So Congress can tell you to spend. It can allow you to spend, but you can't actually access the money. Right? Congress has the power of the purse, but the actual physical purse is still in the executive branch. Historically, this was an incredibly apolitical office. These were the most boring beige bureaucrats. This is the Department of lighting fixtures of the financial system, right? And somebody went and said, what if I start buttering up the IT guys, and maybe the IT guys can help me launch a coup, right? And so they've found the one level of the payment system that is about as centralized as possible and as politicized as possible. As I said, you could go to the bare metal, go to the Fed. You know the problem with the Fed? There's a board. It's independent. They're terrified of pissing off the bond markets. Even when Trump says the entire government's under my control, the one exception he put in his executive order? For the Monetary Policy Committee of the Fed. It's the one last bureaucrat that he's terrified. It's like the final boss. He's working his way up. He needs like a +6 sword before he can get through the armor or something, right? Everyone else has fallen flat. But the good news is he doesn't actually have to take over the Fed to take over the payments. He just goes one level beforehand and shuts off all the information going to the Fed.
How is what is happening right now with Donald Trump? How is that different than impoundment, which I like? And maybe you can explain impound. I assume that most people aren't familiar with impoundment because we haven't dealt with it since Richard Nixon.
Yeah, impoundment, it goes back to the very founding, but it kind of got distorted or grew over time until it became a problem. So the idea of impoundment is Congress tells the president or the executive to spend and then passes a law, and the executive gets that law. It's a valid law, and then the executive goes, no, I don't think I will. And that should immediately get your kind of constitutional separation of powers hackles up. That's not supposed to be how it's supposed to go, right? We didn't say, please spend unless you don't feel like it, in which case do whatever the hell you want. That's a different kind of law. We do write those laws, but when we say, no, I really mean it. seriously though, this time, guys, spend the money. You're not supposed to say no. So going back to Thomas Jefferson, right, and all through the 1800s, there were moments where presidents did this, but it was usually quite limited. It was usually in the context of things like war powers, presidential powers, like very explicitly presidential powers, where it would be something like, we gave you money to build some war boats. The war is now over. So you've decided not to spend the rest of the money. Cool. Okay. We gave you $1 million for roach eradication on day 2 of the roach eradication program. You found a really cool, bioengineering weapon. You've killed all the cockroaches. I guess we don't need to spend the rest of $1 million. Seems reasonable. Other examples like that have come up where they were usually in regards to powers considered to be inherent to the president, right? This is not Congress tells you to do a thing under Congress's power. You're the kind of embodiment of that. You're the conduit for that. It's not that. It's the stuff that is sort of inherent to the president's power. By the time we get to the 20th century, it's starting to expand. The imperial presidency is expanding pretty much ever since Lincoln, certainly Woodrow Wilson with World War I, right? Big World War. We need a president to manage this stuff. Just like we had the debt ceiling starting to make it easier to do debt management, we at the same time have the president taking over the budget. Eventually it gets to Nixon, and of course Nixon just gloves off, fuck it, who cares? And so Nixon says, I'm going to use this power of impoundment to cut off funding to black communities. Community development grants, things like that, highway development going to certain neighborhoods. And I'm going to justify this on the grounds that we don't really have too much money. We're running out, which was a lie. But also just I'm the president and I can do what I want, right? When the president does it, it's not a law. It's not violating the law. Congress threw the book at him. The Supreme Court threw the book at him, right? A famous case called Train in 1975. And then Congress in 1974 passed the Anti-Impoundment Act, Anti-Impoundment Monetary Control Act. And that essentially said, no. Sorry, President, when we tell you to do it, you got to do it. And the Supreme Court reaffirmed case law going back to the 1830s. They've been saying this for a while. They reaffirm a sort of version of it again in the late 90s under Bill Clinton this time because they actually Congress passes a law. This isn't Clinton unilaterally doing it, but Congress passes a law saying the president can do a line item veto. So if you don't like something in the budget, you can cut out the pieces you don't like and sign the rest. And basically the Supreme Court says no. That completely changes the character of the bill. And I think they're right about that. You know, if you've ever read Catch-22, there's a bit where the main character's in hospital and he's censoring letters because he's so bored. They give him a job while he's recovering as a former army pilot. And eventually gets so bored he just censors every word. You know, dear Janet, I yearn for you tragically. That's the entire letter. You know, at a certain point, you can cut out so many parts of a thing that it completely changes what you're saying. So Supreme Court said no. When Congress gives you a bill, you can thumbs up or thumbs down, but you don't get to pick and choose because you're fundamentally changing the character of it. Well, Trump has asserted that right all over again, right? He's asserted the right to ignore the line item veto even without a congressional bill. He's asserted the right to ignore the 1974 bill. He's asserted the right to ignore about 180 years of Supreme Court precedent. But to your question, what's different? I would say this is almost like the Stokey Carmichael line. If you're racist and you got no power, I don't care. He says, right? This is the Black Panther. And he said, but if you're racist and you got power, now I'm worried. Well, believing in impoundment and having no power to do it, right? Believing in empowerment and finding the one magic button that lets you shut off all the money from one seat in the government. Like, you don't even need to leave your basement, you know? That's a very, very different kind of power. Up until now, if you wanted to impound funds at, say, the Department of Education, what would you do? You would go and talk to the education secretary and say, hey, I'd like you to commit an unconstitutional act for me. And the secretary goes, I don't know about that. You know, maybe, all right. But today, President Trump can just bypass that with his lackey, you know, Elon Musk running the Department of Government Efficiency, aka Doge, aka the rebranded US Digital Service, which was actually created by Obama to like digitize the government because, you know, we're the internet president and we're, you know, doing our exit interview with Wired magazine and kite surfing with Richard Branson and, you know, blah blah blah. MIT Media Labs Joey Ito is my, you know, exit interviewer. So Obama sets up the internet government through the USDS, and then Trump moves it from the Office of Management and Budget into the White House office, appoints Elon Musk as this sort of informal director. There's this hilarious legal debate right now where there's actually an administrator written on paper and she's just like MIA. Everybody in Congress, everyone in the news is saying Elon Musk runs this, and they go to court. They're like, well, no, he's just completely unrelated. You know, sure, okay. And Rupert Murdoch doesn't own all of the companies he owns. He just hangs out in the board meetings. Sure. But anyway, to your question, impoundment, I would say today is I have the right to not spend what I don't want to spend, regardless of what Congress says. But I also have a big magic button to do it all. And that big magic button is my prerogative as the commander-in-chief. So it's this unholy alliance of unitary executive theory, of the president as the sole face. I am the Senate. I am the law. You know, I am the sword. Unitary executive theory plus impoundment plus like the nuclear football of money.
One of the things you kind of touch on in the paper that feels a little bit related to this, like the reason they wanted control of the Treasury Bureau of Fiscal Services is because it let them basically choke out every other part of government they wanted to. And one of the things that's interesting in your paper is you talk a little bit about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was set up to be independent and has a different funding structure reliant more on like a amount it can pull from the Fed and its awards that keeps it outside of those different processes. And like part of the reason I'm highlighting this is because despite that fact that it was somewhat independently funded, I believe it was fed into a wood chipper.
It's still there. It's just all turned into stone, like the characters on the outside of like the White Witch in Narnia. You know, you kind of walk in the front door and everybody's there in the middle of doing their office, but they're all petrified. Yeah, no, this is a good example. I mean, this is why you, as I try to write the paper, you need to think of this as sort of three legs of the stool at every point in time. It's the law, it's the political economy, right? It's the money, and it's the technology. And so the CFPB was structured in a very interesting way, which is, and credit to Elizabeth Warren. I didn't appreciate this when I first read this about the CFPB. So credit to her. I've been harsh when she deserves it. She deserves some praise on this one. They designed it so that it was off budget, which means it doesn't have to be annually reappropriated. And it was not going through the Office of Management and Budget. So it has its own budgetary independence. It doesn't have to go to the president and ask to kind of get its monthly allocation. It's almost like grandma leaves you an inheritance, but your parents are like, we're going to give you $100 a week. That's it. You know, we don't want to spend it all. And you're like, well, wait a second. Which one of us got grandma's inheritance? Because it sounds like you're in charge of it, not me. This is the Office of Management and Budget. Congress passes a big spending bill. Office of Management and Budget works out how much you get on a monthly allowance or whatever else. And it's supposed to be all very logistical. We just don't want you to run out of money too soon and then come to us. So we're just trying to help you budget. But it's very, of course, micromanaging and subjective about how they do that. So you've got kind of that layer, and then you've got this coordinating all of the Treasury stuff. And if you kind of put those things together, you end up with this system where there's a lot of centralized bottlenecks. The CFPB tries to avoid all of those. It gives you complete independence. And not only that, the other thing the Treasury is often required to do is essentially do debt laundering. So it's this other obscure subpart of the Treasury we don't talk about, along with the Bureau of Fiscal Service, called the Federal Financing Bank. But the idea is, I think of it almost like, you know, Jesus or the e pluribus unum in the American, you know, sort of motto, out of many into one. All the different agencies that have to issue their own debt it would be a goddamn nightmare for them all to be out there in the economy, right? Department of Education debt, Department of Defense debt, whatever else. Let's just all launder it through the Treasury, right? I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nothing comes out to the bond markets except through me. And now we have one clean, beautiful Treasury bond, right? And so the Federal Financing Bank is laundering all of that. That puts the Treasury in a position to screw with other agencies, right? It's another choke point that the Treasury cannot let you get your money out. And Mnuchin did this back in 2019 with the post office. So Mnuchin said, I'm not going to let you issue debt that Congress told you can issue unless you pre-fund your pension out till the year 2600, basically until we're in season 4 of Star Trek The Next Generation. I need to know that you can cover your postal service employees, right?
That didn't work, though.
He eventually gave up with pressure, but what he learned is this is a good strategy. I just chose the wrong part of the Treasury, right? They just needed Elon Musk to come in and hack the accounts with a ridiculous PR campaign.
Well, and Russ Vought, we shouldn't let him get off without. He has been planning this too. Yes.
Russ Vought is the architect of the Antiimpingment campaign. He's the head of the OMB, and like with what's his name in the first administration, they appointed him head of the CFPB at the same time as head of OMB. I'm forgetting his name, but he was a former legislator. Anyway, it'll come to me. So anyway. The CFPB, its one big problem is that it's technically on the money side is that it's still attached to the Fed. So it gets its money directly from the Fed. That's about as good as you can hope for. There's no government debt involved. There's no borrowing from our grandchildren. It doesn't need to get it from taxes or revenue or even fines. If it says it needs a certain amount, the Fed just basically has to give it to them, and the Fed doesn't have discretion over that. But to your point, originally it was designed so that the head of the CFPB was a single director who could not be removed except for cause. And the Supreme Court a couple of years ago said, no, that's unconstitutional. The president needs to be able to fire at will everybody in the executive branch. Otherwise, he can't do his job as the chief executive. And they didn't go all the way to saying everybody at that point. They only invalidated the CFPB on its own terms. And the version of an agency that's still potentially legal is one that has multiple members rather than one single head. So if you're in a commission where it's sort of 3-2, it's the FTC, it's the SEC, they said that might still be allowed. And to be clear, the current Supreme Court doesn't like that either. They're probably about to get rid of it. But that goes all the way back to a case in the 30s about the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, called Humphrey's Executor. So I think Humphrey's Executor is probably fucked, frankly. But before that, the CFPB was fucked along the way. So the fact that its funding structure is good doesn't mean that it's actually independent, because you can just put your own lackey in the top and tell them to turn off all the budget. But the fact that you can design the budget to be that independent is a model for other agencies. And in fact, Trump tried to fire the head of the National Relations Labor Board, and the Supreme Court, in at least a preliminary ruling, said no, reinstate them while this case goes all the way through. So they haven't been willing to let him completely fire everybody yet.
We talked a little bit there about the problems with the current setup of the Treasury Bureau of Fiscal Services. Can you outline at a high level the new digital fiscal regime that you lay out in your paper?
As I said, if you think about it as 3 levels, there's the legal authority to spend, there's the actual directive to spend, and then there's the processing of the account layer, right? That corresponds to OMB, Treasury, and Fed today. My big argument is we need to basically internalize as much of that as possible inside the legislative branch. So partially this can be through Congress, through its own legislation. Partially it can be through congressional committees and staffer offices and things that kind of negotiate with the executive branch on an ongoing basis. And partially it could be independent agencies within the legislative branch. So the classic ones there are the Government Accountability Office, that used to be called the Government Accounting Office, and the Congressional Budget Office, which I usually hate, but we could repurpose it to be doing something useful with its life. Certainly wouldn't be hard to be more useful than it currently is. So anyway, my pitch for a digital fiscal regime is 3 pieces of technology, sort of accompanying those 3 things that I just mentioned. One is what I'm calling the digital fiscal record. The idea of the fiscal record is basically it's the congressional record of all the laws passed, but it's digital. So they are software, which means you can bake in automatically executing laws that expire after a certain point, laws that are conditional on an external fact, and that fact can point to a third-party trusted source that says, hey, if the inflation gets above a certain point, do X, or if unemployment gets above a certain amount, do Y, or whatever it is. And that statistic could be essentially baked into the law. Then the second layer, I'm calling Congress's Treasury ATM. And the idea here is, what you do is you take internally the authority from the law, that Congress passes a law. You take that authority and you basically get it in the form of credit, a line of credit. And I'm using the metaphor of a credit card, although it probably wouldn't be a physical credit card. It'd be basically a set of permissions. And you access this ATM. And if you have the right permissions, you can get digital dollars in your local account. So the thing that you go to the ATM with from the statute is not money. It's like internally within the government. It's basically almost like an IOU or a credit. So I'm calling it a public credit card. It's the full faith and credit of the United States that Congress gets to issue. I'm an executive agency. I say, hey, here's a bill that says I am allowed to spend $100 billion over 10 years. I go to Congress. Congress says, when we wrote that, what we meant was $10 billion a year. Cool. Here's your credit card. It will work up to $10 billion a year. You could do it, and this is a really key point. You could do this qualitatively, not just quantitatively. You don't have to give them a number. We're so used to thinking of numbers. Like there's a certain kind of person that lives in the world of black Amex all the time. Congress lives in the world of black Amex. So you could fund agencies on an as-needed basis and just tell them as much money as they need they can get. The CFPB is told that it can get as much money as it needs. And last I checked, they don't have luxury resorts in the Caribbean. They actually saved, I think, $600 million that they've earned. They've put it in a savings account for a rainy day that Trump is about to drain for their own independence, basically. But essentially, there's a lot of agencies that operate on an as-needed basis. The Fed doesn't run out of money. If the Fed's not spending, it's because it's exercising its own discipline. So you have this ledger. You pass the laws on the ledger. The ledger says these agencies are allowed to spend. The agency goes to Congress or its representatives and says, can you turn this into practical spending power? They say, yes, here's your credit card. You take the credit card to the ATM and you get digital cash. Why do I split it up like that? A couple of reasons. One is I want to split up the act of determining how much you can spend from the act of approving the withdrawal. The first one is an adjudication. The first one is an interpretation of the existing law. The second one is basically rubber stamping you doing something. It's a different authority. And importantly, with that digital ATM, every individual agency has their own wallet server locally. So you can think about this like we talked about ECASH, where you need to have a device in your pocket to store your cash as a consumer. This is the institutional version of that, but it's not banks and investment funds. It's internally within government. Why is it important for every government agency to have their own money locally in the equivalent of a safe, not at the Fed? Because it means that if Trump takes over the Fed, which is looking increasingly likely at some point, then these agencies could still theoretically have a direct link to Congress's money power.
Wasn't there an example recently of in New York?
Yes. So I'll talk about that in a second. That's about the tax side. I've been talking about the spending side, but this is just as important for protecting your money on the tax side. Because if you can delete dollars out of existence, you can take anybody's money at any point in time. So the last piece of the technology. So step one is the digital record. Step two is the ATM. Step three is what I'm calling the federated federal ledger. And the idea is that Congress has a master spreadsheet of all the government spending that's been done in its name. And every agency has its own accounting spreadsheet, right? Separate from its wallet. Its wallet holds its money, but it has its own separate accounts. And those accounts essentially sync up to the government's main accounting spreadsheet. So this is almost like a sort of semi-blockchain, semi-distributed ledger. I'm not going to say it. We're not putting Congress on the blockchain, but Congress is sort of the one who keeps the master record of everything, and everybody else just gets a little piece, right? Someone's like, oh, it's got a tail, and someone else is like, oh, it's got hoofs, and someone else is like, oh, it's got tusks. It's an elephant. It's just that Congress is the only one that can see the whole elephant, right? It's keeping the copy of all of the individual agencies' ledgers as a master ledger, and each individual agency just keeps its own piece locally. So it's not a distributed ledger because that's one common thing. It's a federated ledger. It's just that the central hub has access to everything else. So to go to your other question, why this is in part important is so that if the president is now a hostile agent within the government, that Congress can still have a direct fiscal conduit, a direct fiscal channel to each sub-agency within the government, right? It's the disunitary executive. And what they did in New York is they decided to punish New York state government, that they said that they'd accidentally gave them some money they didn't deserve, and they just debited $80 million out of their bank account. They took it out of the bank, the Citibank, I think it was Citibank that the state of New York banks with. They took it out of Citibank's reserve account at the Fed and told Citibank to take it out of the city's account, the state's account. So we are at the point now where you can basically be unilaterally taxed as a penalty, and your money is not safe. So putting this stuff in a wallet that's safe in the agency means that the president can't delete it all. And if we are really at the level where I think we're getting pretty close to in terms of 11 minutes till midnight for the breakdown of the constitutional fabric of this country, we might really need to be talking about what it means to like keep up a financing regime for like the part of the government that isn't going with the Trump side of things when it goes that way.
We can get more into the weeds of this stuff here in a second, but I feel like it's worth talking to you about this, and this is maybe more philosophical than like detailed law. But one of the things when Bennett and I were talking yesterday about this, I was like, I'm pretty worried about the future of, for instance, Federal Reserve independence. I'm pretty worried about the Treasury Secretary doing whatever the fuck Donald Trump wants. Like, these are things that I'm already like, well, like you just said, 11 minutes to midnight, like 2 minutes to midnight, right? Like, I feel like we're there. And I guess part of what I said to Bennett was, I kind of don't get it. Like, he's doing this quite detailed paper where he's discussing fixing a lot of these problems that we now know absolutely exist. But you know as well as I do that this stuff takes a really long time to get
We'll get the supermajority in Congress to pass a bill doing a task force and research all this stuff, and then the president will slowly implement it all, and then we'll go, oh no, I've got no power anymore. I accidentally built the machinery of my own constraint. Yes.
And I guess my worry here is that what Bennett responded to me, and maybe this is exactly what your answer is, but what Bennett said to me was, I think this is Rohan preparing for cleaning up after the ashes have settled. And do you think that's
partially it's that. Partially there's a number of countries around the world that actually do have parliamentary systems and saying, hey guys, watch out, right? Watch out. It's coming for you too. If you want a parliamentary system, and think about it, right? Think about it in the context of a place like Europe where they have proportional representation, where every parliamentary majority is a weird amalgam of 3 different parties. Imagine being able to say to them, we're going to divide the fisc so that you have a direct line to 1/3 of the fisc or whatever it is. I mean, this is a very important way of structuralizing, of materializing the legal divisions of power that we actually need to keep legitimacy of government working. So yes, partially it's like, hey, you know how America went imperial presidency? You're all kind of on the edge of that. If you want to have a thing called a parliamentary system with ministerial independence, because theoretically the Treasury Secretary is supposed to be independent, right? Treasury Secretary is supposed to be able to say, I have my own independent duty to the Constitution. Yeah, Bennett's laughing, right? Of course he's laughing. Right? The idea of Treasury independence in this day and age is a fucking joke. The Fed is supposed to be independent, right? The Fed's still doing that to a degree until it isn't, right? Until Humphrey's executive gets overturned. And I don't think the Supreme Court's going to want to go after the Fed, so I'll be curious to see the jujitsu they do about that line, at least initially. But it also is to me actually a bit of a kind of wartime vision, which is to say, if we're at the point of like Confederacy money, if we're at the point of like which one of these agencies is going to go with which person, or if Congress says one thing. And the problem, of course, is we don't have any of the branches. Congress is on their side. The Supreme Court's on theirs. Like, who is the legitimate branch calling out the other branch at this point? Nobody. But if we do get to that point, where he's just gloves off and somebody wants to say, hey, we're not going to let this happen, then a vision of how digital money could work, where you could essentially run a distributed wartime government without needing one. I mean, think about it also from a resiliency point of view. You're in the middle of a civil war and you've got one place where all the money goes through. I mean, Congress in this situation has to be the place where the authority gets made, but that could be a football. You could be carrying that around with you, right? It could be on the run. If you want like actual locations making money and sending it out to do economic organization during a serious route, then you don't want that all going through one place, because then you just bomb or occupy that place. So partially this is a vision for a sort of democratically resilient institutional structure for the fisc. And that's just as relevant during the Troubles as after the Troubles. But we won't even know what it could look like until we start talking about it. So this is a vision of like, hey, if we had this working today, we wouldn't have these problems. The best time to do this was yesterday. The next best time to do it is today.
Well, and I can also imagine, depending on how things play out, if there are multiple governments claiming legitimacy, it is likely there will be multiple currencies trying to claim legitimacy.
Suddenly we might find ourselves
So,
needing to rebuild this stuff from scratch either way, because the pieces that are already in place are not actually under our control on the chessboard.
yeah, or have just been nuked off the chessboard in general.
Yeah,
Someone's
that's right.
flipped the chessboard upside
Chairman
down.
Powell's sitting there with a gun outside of camera saying, I've decided to continue, you know, like he's sweating on the camera, you know. And all this sounds so extreme, except it's kind of not. Right? All of this sounded really crazy a month ago, and now everybody's gone Pepe Sylvia, not just me.
Cass and I are across the Rubicon. We're
I put crossing the Rubicon in the paper, right? We crossed the Rubicon a while ago, and you know, even since I wrote the paper, he's been defying judicial orders.
Yeah, which at the time when you initially wrote it, one of the lines is, "Thus far, Trump has yet to openly refuse to obey a federal court order." And I was reading it yesterday as I was watching the plane land in El Salvador.
Yeah, I part of what I talk about in the paper is that if you're smart, you can use the technology of law and the technology of keeping accounting as the execution. So the legislature is not taking over the executive responsibility. It's not actually making the money. It's not actually printing the paper. It's not actually making the payments, but it is keeping score. And it's got the right to keep score constitutionally, right? If you control the laws, if you can say, hey, I told you to spend $36. By that, I meant this. You're not doing that. It's sort of like somebody keeping track of the soccer World Cup in their basement, and the referee gives the other team a goal and you're like, I don't agree with that. Here's the true score. But you're God. So now your score in the basement matters more than the FIFA, right? Like that's Congress. Congress isn't the one running the stadium, but it is the only one whose opinion constitutionally is legitimate about what spending has and hasn't been authorized by Congress. Anyway, all of which is to say, my magic sauce, my technological insight here is, if you do that with the technology of law itself, if you do that with the technology of accounting, just the act of passing the law is itself a form of programmable software. I don't have programmable software in my paper. Otherwise, I would have made that an exploding sentence. I would have made it a self-expiring sentence requiring renewal, like you need to renew the appropriations authority every week. I would have had that sentence self-delete unless I went back in and reauthorized it with a bit more juice every week. But yes, I underestimated how quickly it would die.
I thought it was also interesting reading this paper, and you allude to this in the paper. Elon Musk and Mario Nawfal have announced their plan to put the Treasury on the blockchain. Is that different than this plan?
Well, I would say, I mean, first of all, it is different. I don't think you need a blockchain in general. And I think if you are trying to do the distributed stuff that I'm trying to do for resiliency, blockchain's the wrong solution for the same reason as I talked about with ECASH, right? It's the wrong solution for a digital dollar for consumers. It's also the wrong solution for a digital dollar intragovernmentally, or a digital dollar credit. But of course, what he means is that the executive gets to control it. So even if it is a blockchain, like, fuck it, fine, put it on a blockchain, but let Congress control the blockchain, not you. And I don't think he's going to be as excited about that. What he means is, you know, I want all of these payments to be visible. And
he doesn't mean anything. Let's be honest.
He doesn't know what he means.
He likes blockchain. He likes the people who like blockchains liking him. He doesn't even particularly like blockchains.
I think the best way to understand it metaphorically is, what he's saying is, attack government corruption through the tech layer. And that's what they've done. Trump found his tech wizard, right? He found his Jafar. He found his magician, and his magician's doing magic shit with alchemy.
Could you talk a little bit about how the digital dollars that are part of kind of this new digital fiscal regime are similar to and different from CBDCs?
Yeah. So the first thing is they're not issued by the central bank, right? When you try to understand what a central bank digital currency is, you leave feeling pretty confused and gaslit. And the only truth of it all is we don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to do. We don't know how it's going to be designed. We do know it's going to be issued by the central bank. It's in the name. We spent 4 hours with the word central bank on the board, and what we discovered is that a central bank digital currency is, in fact, a digital currency issued by central banks. After furious debate, we have all come to consensus that that's what it is, and that's the only thing we can all agree on. What that means is that from an accounting point of view, it is at once a legal obligation of the federal government and of the Fed. You know, if you're one of these Fed is private guys, the case to read is US v. Wells Fargo from 2019 in the Second Circuit, where they said that the emergency funds that the Federal Reserve lent out to bail out banks, even though it never came from a quote-unquote taxpayer or from the Treasury, it counts as public money. It counts as money from the constitutional Treasury, the theoretical Treasury up in the sky, the Treasury in our hearts, right? Anywhere there's two people, that's Jesus' church. Anywhere there's someone moving public money around, that's the Treasury. So that's the kind of general idea, is that this digital dollar would be a generic liability of the government, a monetary obligation, full faith and credit. Backed by the full faith and credit, it's legal tender, so you can use it to pay any public or private debt at its face value. Could pay interest or not, depending on how they want to design it. Maybe different parts of it will pay interest, different parts won't. And every agency, if it gets its authority from Congress, from a spending statute, from an appropriation bill, can get its credit card, which is to say its set of permissions, and it goes to the ATM and it can withdraw that money on its local wallet or its local device. I'm calling it an e-purse, just to keep with the coinage metaphor. Once it's stored locally, it's offline. It's peer-to-peer. It's the same as ECASH. You can send it to another device like that, or you could even deposit it at the Fed, or you could put it in a check, or you could send it to someone's ECASH local device wallet or whatever else. And it would be monetary, right? It would not be debt as we understand it in the public sense. So there's no borrowing from our grandkids and all that bullshit. And the authority comes directly from Congress, right? It's that signature, from Congress. It's that appropriation bill that matters first and foremost. And then every individual agency would essentially have their like piece of it, a fragmented fisc, right? A distributed fisc. The other part of it, which I will expand out in a later paper and is not really the point right now, although it was part of the point of my original paper when I wrote this 3 years ago and kind of predicted to a degree what just happened. And again, I don't know whether it's better to be able to see the future and never be able to change it or not, going insane like Cassandra from the Greek mythology. But the other part that I talk about here is how do you make sure you don't fuck with monetary policy, right? How do you not mess with central bank independence? Like, I've got my thoughts about central bank independence. This is not the day. This is not the moment. I'm not trying to litigate every single fight in my life at the moment. But the way that I did that, or the metaphor that I've used for this is, and again, I'm trying to use constitutional terms and almost make them literal. So as I said, we're drawing money from the ATM. We're coining digital coins, right? We are doing these things. Is that the Fed would be authorized to essentially take over responsibility for issuing all forms of government debt, which is basically how it does monetary policy today. It buys and sells government securities, treasury securities, and mortgage-backed securities, but it has to wait for someone else to issue them. It's sort of like gambling with someone else's chips that they manufacture. It's like, why don't you just make them yourself? Oh, well, I couldn't do that. You can. Other central banks have talked about issuing central bank debt. About 40% of central banks in the world do issue central bank debt in various forms, usually in places where the Treasury doesn't issue enough of its own to help the bond markets. Like, they want the investment asset. So the idea is if your regular money that you and I are spending is digital gold, make that digital silver. So they have their own separate parallel form of set of digital instruments. And that allows the Fed to do its own monetary policy. If it wants interest rates to be positive, if it wants a savings instrument, if it wants to have financial markets have an asset, everything the Treasury markets do today, just put it under the Fed and keep it out of the government spending process. So that's the idea, is that you would have all of this go into coins, and there would be the kind of retail coins that you and I use, and then there would be this sort of highbrow wholesale institutional coins that would be more like government debt that people would use for savings and investment and whatever else.
Don't you think a lot of people, I know a lot of our listeners, whether we agree with them or not, I know that a lot of our listeners would be surprised by the idea that you're having, like, your concept of future good monetary governance is federating it more, essentially trying to make it
it's centralizing it around Congress. It's centralizing the decision making and it's decentralizing the execution.
Right. But then we're also talking about giving the Fed the ability to, like you said, the abilities they already have.
It already has that power.
Right.
It just has it poorly. It just has it badly. It's like someone's already asking you to drive your kids to school. It's just that the car's stuck in first gear. Weird.
Right. Right. And now it's being threatened. Right. Like, I guess a lot of our listeners say stuff like, oh, the Fed controls the world, whatever.
Not a lot of our listeners, like 3 loud listeners in YouTube comments. Most of our listeners are not saying that.
The Fed can barely control inflation. I wish it had more control over the shit that it claims to control. It knows how to throw workers out of work eventually, in the sense that if I turn the temperature up in my house, eventually I'll kill all the plants. But that doesn't mean I know how to garden. I just know how to nuke things, It can nuke the labor market. I haven't seen it actually deal with inflation directly very well.
The Fed regional banks are mediocre at even agreeing with their other regional banks.
Yeah. And the thing is, the Fed regional banks don't exist anymore in a legal sense. They exist in a very boring practical sense. But it's the board of governors in DC that runs the show, and they're a bunch of bureaucrats. I wish it was this conspiracy theory about bankers running the world. It's far more boring. It's Eichmann in Jerusalem. It's a bean counter with a statistics degree, earning $200,000 and going home at 3 p.m. on a Friday. That's the face of evil at the Fed.
Stepping away from the evil Federal Reserve here for a second, but my point here being that I think a lot of listeners, regardless of their thoughts on Federal Reserve conspiracies.
Yeah, the banality of the evil of the Federal Reserve, yes.
Yeah, outside of that, I think a lot of our listeners probably think that there is a centralization problem, or that, that they disagree with the way money is controlled.
Yeah.
The dollar is controlled.
Yeah.
And I think it's just really interesting and stunning to see it. It's so fragile, actually, I guess is what I'm coming to understand in these last few months. Things that Bennett and I were saying in November are coming true already. And, that is not something you expect that has been the reserve currency of the entire world for this long to fall apart that quickly. And yeah, it's like, I assume that this is like you being influenced by current events, but, you also said that, you feel like Cassandra, and that you predicted this. So I guess I'm kind of wondering how you're feeling and why you think it's important to take the monetary governance system in this direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, the rumors of America's decline as a global imperial hegemon are always grossly over exaggerated. Do you know what I mean? I think it's one thing to say the country's fucking itself up. It's another thing to say the minute that Rome starts fucking itself up, something else is going to take its place. It takes a few hundred years sometimes. I'm not going to say it's take that long in this day and age. But there is going to be a while in which this is just a really shitty hegemonic dynamic, because there's still nuclear bases all around the world. There's still the entire Western United Nations regime that's wrapped around American power as if it was a tumor that you can't get rid of without killing the patient. So I'm not convinced that there's going to be a reserve currency tomorrow, because the entire thing is built with America at the center. That doesn't mean they're not going to try. It doesn't mean we're not going to see a sapping of power. But I think probably my favorite TV show, sci-fi show for sure at the moment, is Foundation, because it's sort of the end of an empire, based on the sci-fi. But I highly recommend it if you haven't watched it. But the idea is this sort of galactic empire is collapsing, and it's going to collapse in 500,000 years, and it's going to cause 30,000 years of darkness. And maybe we can slow it down a little bit. Maybe we can make it 8,000 years of darkness. We're not going to stop it collapsing. It's a very bleak starting point, but you end up having a sense of the scale of what you need to do to try to arrest or lean into imperial decline. So all of that is to say, I'm not sure that America is going to die tomorrow, but when we think about it, there is a centralization problem in a lot of different ways. But a part of why those problems could persist, in my opinion, is that they obscure themselves. They hide themselves. And a lot of the time we end up thinking it's the central bank because we think of it as the place that makes money. Oh my gosh, of course that's the place to go. Why'd you rob the bank? That's where the money is. That's the joke. But if you actually understand where the government works, it's the budget. It's fiscal policy first. Monetary policy is like a laundering device. It's like I don't know about you, but when I set up my bank account at the credit union, they gave me a savings account first. And then I got a checking account, right? And you get multiple checking accounts if you want to, but you get one savings account per person. The Treasury debt is like the savings account. The checking account is a more practically useful version of it, but all your money goes into that savings account first. And so if you're wanting to know how much money the government's creating, right, how much of an impact it's having on the world, it's the budget, it's Congress. The Fed comes later in the story. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of be really clear where the power is, be really clear who's responsible. Part of the big problem, as you probably know, is this, what they call the exorbitant privilege of the United States, where it's simultaneously a domestic actor doing its own domestic shit like the rest of us, and simultaneously supposed to be this benevolent God sitting above us all, managing the global world on behalf of everybody. I just had an international law scholar come to my school and give a talk about that kind of stuff, about how they're, benevolent Kantians. And I'm like, last I checked, you're Americans, not Kantians. And there's a pretty big difference in where you universalize your rules, right? But this is the problem, is as long as this is all in some neutral technocratic Federal Reserve that thinks of itself as part of some global class, we hide these problems. If it's Congress, nobody's going to pretend that Congress gives a shit about the rest of the world. Have you met Congress? I've met them. So I think the risk at this moment is that we focus in the wrong places, we ignore the important stuff, and we miss these sort of huge, big red buttons that are able to be co-opted. We spent how many years talking about CBDCs? Who the hell talked about the Bureau of the Fiscal Service? Me.
What you're highlighting there is kind of interesting to me, and you parallel this, I think, with debt ceilings in the paper, where this boring thing, whether it's the Treasury Bureau of Fiscal Services or the debt ceiling, that is meant to exist primarily for just logistical and managing the functions of government thing. Eventually, one person looks at the actual rules governing that thing and goes, "Oh, that's a gear. If I pull that out, the whole thing stops working."
Wait, are you saying we can pass backwards in NFL? What if we just try passing backwards for an entire game and someone does that and wins 3 games until we work out how to block that hole, right? Yeah, it's a hack, right? It's a hack in the most fundamental definitional sense. It's a creative repurposing of something to achieve a different end and increase your kind of control. And I think one of the things that it's done is it's totally redrawn the map of the administrative state. The administrative state had these 1,000 different individual islands and archipelagos and things. No, it's got three buttons now. That's the administrative state. You just turn it off. There's power off, If you've ever seen that Gary Larson cartoon of electric chair operators night school, and there's a person with their hand up and the teacher's like, "No, stand down, then up again real fast isn't the right answer." Does anyone else have the right answer? It's sort of like that. How do I run a government? I just go in and press buttons. Oh no, I've broken the whole budget,
Yeah. And part of the reason I found the paper so compelling is that I don't think there's an easy path back to September 2024, right?
You can't unpoliticize it. You can't unpoliticize
exactly.
it. Just like we politicize the filibuster, just like we politicize judicial nominations. This is a escalation that keeps going until it breaks. And it is all very boring and very technical. Unless you know where to look, then you don't know. It's that Leonard Cohen song I love a lot. They sentenced us to 20 years of boredom for trying to change a system from within. Now we're coming to reward them, And Elon Musk is the hacker guy, right? This is, as I said, this is Trump's magician. I don't know how all that stuff works. Everything is computer. Well, you've got a computer guy, and that guy knows how to hack shit. And what he did quite fairly is look at the government and say, I don't care where you tell me the vulnerabilities are. I'm going to look at it like an engineer, and there are the vulnerabilities. And I'm like, those are exactly the engineering vulnerabilities. You're a terrible person doing it for terrible reasons, but you did identify a piece of this that everybody missed because they were just, I try to get my colleagues to use Element, a secure messaging service that is federated. It's like Signal, but you can self-host. Nobody wanted to talk about it for years. Well, now everything's getting shut down. It's starting to be now a distributed, federated system starting to sound a little bit more important, isn't it?
And I think what's also interesting is in re-engineering these technical things that can work more fundamentally, longer and better than legislative solutions, because there's already an Anti-Impounding Act. We did that after Nixon. It's on the books. It exists. It hasn't been overturned by the Supreme Court yet, but with a sufficiently bad actor who's willing to grab the lever and say, no, this is my lever now, the laws can be overturned. The technical infrastructure requires more of like, you need physical people to go physically do things, and that's a different tenor of thing. And so that was another thing I appreciated when reading through this paper.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, somewhere in between the 39,000 words or something, I try to put a few memes in there to keep it palatable. and there was an Onion headline, which I love, which was sort of Trump asserts little known, no one's going to stop me loophole to break the Constitution, you know. And the other one was the line from The Big Lebowski, you know, well, that's just your opinion, man.
Yeah.
Like the courts can say, hey, you can't do that. And I don't know if you ever remember that bit from the now disgraced comedian Louis C.K., but he's talking about how he goes to the airport and he has to drop off his car and he's running late and he calls the car people. And it's like, it's in the car park outside the terminal. They're like, no, you got to deliver it to us. He's like, well, I'm on the plane. So what are you going to do about that? And they're like, oh, man. All right, we'll pick it up. And he's like, that's when I realized I could do anything I wanted because they needed the car more than I did. And I was like, that's a terrible realization for you, knowing who I know now, who you're going to become or who you're in the process of being. But that's what Trump found out, right? I can just do what I want and people have to stop me. And it's actually a lot of work to stop people doing things, especially with a system that's built to not make that very easy. And so to your point, I don't think technology is a substitute for law, right? I don't think it's a substitute for collective political action. I'm not a techno-solutionist, but the technological architecture, the topology of the landscape matters, right? It matters whether you're on the top of a mountain and you're the Swiss defending everyone attacking you. Like, there's a reason the Swiss get to be neutral, and it's not because they're amazingly great politicians. They're fucking goat herders. They just happen to live in the mountains. You know, it's a useful place to live if you're trying to avoid being attacked. So I think the technological regime shapes the power politics. It shapes the debate. While you're fighting at the courts, it matters who has control over the escrow account, right? While you're fighting these things, it matters who gets first mover advantage, who gets to control the data in the meantime, et cetera, et cetera.
Reminds me of the likely apocryphal Andrew Jackson story. The court has made its ruling, now let it see it, enforce it. Or the Stalin one, Castle. How many divisions does the Pope have?
Yeah, how many divisions does the Pope have? That's his ruling, let him enforce it. Yeah, and we saw this with the switch in time that saves 9 in the 30s if you have enough material support. The problem is now, sitting in one seat with one button, it's an incredibly powerful move that by the time you challenge it, you can do too much damage. You know, you can stop basically oxygen. You know, I remember reading somewhere recently, it terrified me again after I first read it, that we're sort of 96 hours away from a revolution in any country if you stop feeding people.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah.
3-4 days.
If you shut energy off or something like that.
We're 4 days of food production away from a crisis in any country. Yeah, energy as well. But like the government, how many days can it survive with its payment system shut down?
Right.
How many days can any agency launch any effective resistance to this imperial takeover with its payment system shut down? You just zero out every agency.
That was the reason I particularly wanted to have you on to discuss this, was because I think a lot of people, maybe not people who listen to this show, but I think a lot of people who don't maybe even take in that much media at all don't understand that when you start messing with the monetary system, that's everything. That is everything else. And so when you start fucking with that,
you can't coordinate an economy this complicated without it.
Right.
Even in World War II, even when all of the planners inside the Department of Defense, it's all how much steel, how many planes. Like, even when they're thinking at that level, they're still paying people in money.
you have to. Yeah, you have to. And so I thought it was really important to discuss this, just because I think, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of this that is intricate, and a lot of it that is maybe tough to grapple with and understand. But like, it's unfortunately now our duty as citizens of America to have to familiarize ourselves.
We're all sentenced to 20 years of boredom trying to change the system from within.
Yeah. That's complex monetary policy.
Probably
Thank
2 to
you,
4
Trump.
years of not very much boredom first.
I did 20, so you only take 6 months. That's my curse. But yeah, I mean, the other line I had in there. Well, there's two other funny memes. One is from Family Guy with the Blue Harvest episode about Star Wars, where Stewie's Darth Vader, and he's like, "We finally built the Death Star. It's the most amazing." He's like, "Yeah, so no problems." The guy's like, "Oh, yeah, no, none. He's like, couldn't help but notice you hesitated a minute. He's like, oh, it's not a big deal. He's like, wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask about what that 1%, 0.1%. He's like, well, it's just an aesthetic choice, really. But there's this one shoot where if you put a missile down it kind of blows up the whole thing. And he's like, whoa, really? Can't we get rid of that? Oh, it looks so ugly. Well, let's just do it. He's like, well, we can do it tomorrow if money's no object. We'll get estimates. Yes, get estimates. Yes, get estimates. It's just like a perfect ending to the bit. But the other one is the bit from Rick and Morty where he takes over the galactic government. And he's like, I'm going to blow up he's like, I've hacked into the mainframe. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to destroy all the bombs? Are you going to, he's like, no, something better. I'm going to make the dollar, the currency is one of itself worth zero of itself. And then everyone in the room's like, you can't do that. The empire is great. Wait, who's paying me to say this? I can tell you that. For money, and then they all just start shooting each other and turn on themselves. But it's amazing when you take that engine out and realizing how many pieces here, this is Milton Friedman's great idea that everybody making a pencil doesn't give a shit about each other. Well, once the money stops working, everybody stops giving a shit about each other again,
I really appreciated the line in there, if political independence requires budgetary independence and budgetary independence requires being able to actually spend money, then political independence is in turn at least partly a function of payment system design. Like if we believe
that's my syllogism, right? Tattoo that on my ass, on my gravestone,
If we believe what's allegedly written in the Constitution, then it makes sense to hand these powers to Congress very explicitly to function the way these things are supposed to function.
Yeah, and the thing that's crazy is also, if you look at the Constitution, it mentions a bunch of stuff that you actually can't understand without reference to physical stuff. What is coining money? Well, you ask a kid in 2200, unless we have a digital coin to metaphoricize, they'll have no fucking clue what you're talking about. What is drawing money from the Treasury? This is a physical process, right? Even if it's metaphorical. It's if you've ever seen Monty Python's Life of Brian, they're all standing at the back of the Sermon on the Mount. What's he saying? Well, I think he's blessing all the cheesemakers. Cheesemakers? Well, it's a metaphor, obviously. He means manufacturers of any dairy product. Took me till I was about 14 to realize he was talking about peacemakers and they just couldn't hear him properly. But the Constitution specifically mentions physical acts, borrowing on credit, paying money, drawing down stuff. So there's always been this material infrastructure that the Constitution relies on. That material infrastructure can evolve. It can change, but it's still there. So I had a colleague who read the first third and was like, he's showing the kind of the material infrastructure necessary for constitutional imaginary myth. And I think that's the truth. To tell a myth, you still need to set it in a period, right? There's a difference between Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. So we've been telling the Lord of the Rings story of the Constitution. We need to tell a Star Wars story of the Constitution. Or maybe a gold-placed latinum of Star Trek or something,
Rohan, are you excited for Trump to mint the $1 trillion coin?
Oh man, God, I think maybe I mentioned this last time I was on, but it's been a terrifyingly accurate way of living, which is I've got to work out how to kind of get a good line of it, but the most maximally literarily hilarious and absurd timeline is usually the timeline we end on. Not all the time, but it's the electron kind of ring that's the most resonant, it's the lowest frequency. If we can go fucking absurd, if we can be like a FX series where you're like, that's a bit out there, and someone's like, just wait, they'll lap it up. The public will love this. We'll go weird season 6. It's going to go weird. That usually is the right answer. So if somebody said to me, yeah, Trump's going to mint the coin as a way to avoid the shutdown.
It's going to have his face on it, too.
It's going to have his fucking face. Of course it's going to have his face on it. And you know what we're going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about the legality of putting a living person on the coin. We're not going to talk about the 1 trillion on the other side. We're going to talk about his face. It'll be a great bit. Put his face and Musk's face on 2 coins and then have everyone debate which one they like more. And before you notice, we mint $2 trillion coins.
And then you can bet on Polymarket which one they're going to pick.
Exactly, right? And then, you know what? Then he can try to deposit it at the Fed, and the Fed can say no, and he'll actually have a legitimate legal basis for getting mad at the Fed.
Can't have a legal president.
Hey, you don't have the right to say no. You're a fiscal agent.
I'm glad you're going crazy with this because I had to cope with this with the penny decision when he was like,
no more. Before this, everybody who knows me, my photo online, it's all gone. It's completely pulled out now.
When he did the penny, but I love that my whole thing was like, we got to get rid of the penny and the nickel, and then he got rid of the penny, and everyone's like, haha, I feel like you happy about this, Cas? And I'm like, Well, at least he fucked the nickel part up, so he still looks like an asshole, you know?
Yeah. I mean, and frankly, at this point, like, watching him with all this stuff about going after Canada and Greenland and stuff, you know, he said the other day it would look so nice on the map. And I'm like, I love that for him. I love that this is a man who's playing Risk with the world and coloring in like a 8-year-old, and it's like, I don't like having to draw this line. It should all be one color up here. And like, that's his thinking. So yeah, could the coin work? Like when I wrote my coin paper, I said part of the reason it's valuable is because you can tell this story to 7-year-olds. I just didn't think that it would be the president as the 7-year-old in mind. But yeah, find the most absurd story that's going to keep people eating popcorn and not turning back to HBO prestige drama. That's probably the one. So yeah, I'm not putting the minting of the coin at 0%. Of course, that would require the Democrats to have a backbone and actually resist on the shutdown. So that's the actual major reason that Trump wouldn't mint the coin, is because they wouldn't get an opportunity.
At least our listeners can go out and purchase the brand new Platinum Cas coin, available at all your favorite
put $1 trillion on it now, and when Congress is in hiding and running away like Estonia's digital government, you know, and it's the anti-pope living out in up in Canada, you can tell them you've already pre-funded the war for them. There you are.
Listen, at some point in the next year, some currency pretending to be $1, it's going to be $1 trillion to one Cas coin.
This is partially why all this crypto technology is interesting, because it is a lot harder to say, hey, we should build our own, you know, anti-Trumpian government currency in live time if you don't even know how to build one. But we have the capacity to actually sort of bootstrap one relatively quickly now, in a way that
not as fast as Trump can make another Trump coin, though.
not as fast as he can just shut down every government agency. Yeah, I mean, This is always interesting. To go back to where we started with this, the Bureau of the Fiscal Service, the guy was a guy named David LeBrook. He was the most senior civil servant in the Treasury. He'd been there for 20 years plus, right? He was the guy with the keys to all this stuff. And when Trump came in with his Doge boys, right, Peter Pan and his Lost Boys came in and said, give us the keys to the castle, he said no. And they said, well, why not? He said, well, I've got, legal obligations. I'm like, I can't do this. And he said, there'd be liability. And the response from the Doge team was, there'll be liability for you if you don't. And he resigned. And then he kind of did his little PR tour telling everyone how terrible they are. But the fact that there's one seat in that Treasury office, one guy with one set of passcodes. What does that say? I mean, this is the Death Star. This is the Death Star with one chute going down to the middle. Why the hell did we build a system where there was one signature that could stop 88% of all federal payments? And that guy is a bureaucrat. Terrifying. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to chat. Hopefully in a few more months we'll be able to do a round 2 without it being too late.